Well, folks, we're finally at the end of Request Month 2020, and this will be the final review before the regular schedule of just whatever I happen to be working on at any given moment resumes. This is my full review of the 2016 reboot of Doom for PC, Xbox One, PlayStation 4, and Switch, and of course what you're seeing here is the PC version, which is coming to you courtesy of Grotnot, who sent me a copy of this to review. So thank you for that, it is greatly appreciated. Now I hear some of you out there already saying, but DW, you already reviewed this, which is not the case. I did not review this. I did a my thoughts on video on it, and I had not finished the game at the time and was still quite bitter at it. By the time I had done that video, I had attempted to play through the game twice, once on Ultra Violence and once on Nightmare difficulty, and I had given up both attempts because it was just too infuriating. In the years since then, I have made 3 additional attempts to play through the game, with the third one finally being successful, so it took me 5 tries to actually play through this game in its entirety. And before some of you might take to the comments and go, oh, DW just sucks at first-person shooters or something like that, understand that it wasn't because of difficulty that I stopped playing it every single time until now. I'll explain more about that in a moment, but before I do, let me go ahead and talk about what the game is if you've been living under a rock for the past 4 years. It's a first-person shooter developed by id Software and published by Bethesda Softworks in 2016 for PC, Xbox One, and PS4, and it released on the Switch the following year. And while the Switch version was less well received than the other 3 versions, the game in general was extremely well received across the board, both for critics and players, to the point where it has created something of a completely rabid fan base along the same lines as Blizzard fans or Valve fans, where if you even remotely criticize the games that they enjoy, then you'll just get a massive amount of weapons-grade vitriol leveled at you. Or at least that was the case back when I did my original video on the game, which was about a month or so after the game released, so all of the hype was still fresh in everybody's minds back then. And I'll admit that my tone in the video was rather dismissive or argumentative depending on what I was talking about, and when I took to the comments that tended to carry over a bit, so that didn't really help matters, but that doesn't change the fact that some of the people in that fan community need to chill the hell out. But this video isn't about the Doom Reboot fanbase, nor is it about validating anyone's particular opinion on the game. What I'm going to do instead is take a critical look at the game, see what works, what doesn't work, and whether it recaptures the spirit of the original Doom games, or whether it does something else entirely. But before I start delving further into the game, I do need to mention that the original Doom and Doom 2 are 2 of my favorite first-person shooters ever. I have been playing both of them regularly since 1994, which means at this point I've been playing them for give or take 26 years. And while I only play through the entirety of both Doom 1 and Doom 2 every few years, I usually play through at least E1 of the original Doom and maybe the first 10 or so levels of Doom 2 every couple of months. If I hit a period of time where I've gone through a bunch of reviews of stuff that I just haven't been having fun with, then more often than not I'll jump into the original Doom or Doom 2 as a sort of palate cleanser to get me back in the spirit of actually doing things. And if I'm working on something that I'm just not having any fun with and I feel my motivation levels draining to the point where I don't really feel like working on the game at all, then I can actually use the original Doom and Doom 2 as a sort of adrenaline shot to give me the dose of fun I need to be able to power through it. So I'm going into this review as a fan of the original games who understands how they look, sound, and play, and expects the game to basically take that and carry it over into the modern era with everything that we've learned in the years since then. So without further ado, let's go ahead and start delving right into this and find out whether they managed to pull that off or whether something else entirely happened. And like always, we'll go ahead and start with the presentation. Now this was the first game to be using id Tech 6, which is the current version of id's proprietary engine, and even though it has been a few years since the game released, and we have seen a couple of other games using the engine in the meantime that have used more updated versions of said engine, the visuals in this still look quite excellent, with some very strong modeling and smooth animations, some rather good texture work, as well as some fantastic particle effects and lighting that really do make the game look quite good. And on top of all of that, the game's performance is rock solid. Now, I'm running an i7 4790K 16 gigs of RAM and a GTX 1080, and on max settings at 1080p, I'm getting around 90 to 130 frames per second average. Do keep in mind though that I did run this on the OpenGL API to make it easier for me to record this, so performance is going to improve if you use the Vulkan API, and obviously your performance is going to vary depending on what actual hardware you're using, but regardless, the game does run very well. All that said, however, there is one issue with the visuals that does get a bit annoying. It's certainly not a deal breaker or anything, but there is a very noticeable amount of texture pop in, and while once those textures have actually loaded into memory for that particular level, it's not a problem from then until the end of the level. It is something that you will notice on occasion. But even looking at the visuals, aside from simply the visual fidelity and finding it all very strong, they also absolutely nailed the visuals of Doom. If you compare this to the original Doom and Doom 2, it really does carry over that whole cyber hell aesthetic extremely well, and the imagery here is exactly the kind of stuff you would expect from a heavily modernized Doom. So they really nailed the visuals, but what about the sound design? Well, that's where things get a lot more mixed. You see, the voice acting is fine, it's perfectly acceptable for what it is. I wasn't really expecting stellar performances in Doom, but the actors do a decent enough job with their characters, although there's not really much to do with them, to be honest. But then you move over into the sound effects themselves, and that's where the sound design really starts to collapse in on itself. You see, they really nailed the sound effects for all of the gruesome gore, with the enemies being torn apart and beaten up and all that sort of thing. But then there's the actual gun and explosion sounds. Or I should say the gun sounds, because you basically can't hear the explosions. I will never understand what possessed the sound designers to think that the explosion sounds should be so low impact and so soft that you basically can't hear them over the sounds of literally everything else. I mean, think about it this way. You launch a rocket at something, and when it hits and explodes, you can barely hear that, but oh, you can certainly hear when you grab an opponent's leg and just twist it in this horribly unnatural way to smash their own head with it. It's just utterly baffling. Similarly baffling are the really low-impact gun sounds, where the vast majority of them just don't sound very powerful at all, and even if you do upgrade them all the way and the sound does change slightly depending on what you're using, you're still barely getting any volume out of them, and there's certainly no bass kick behind them, so they just don't sound beefy enough. Now, you may not think it's that big of a deal to have low-impact weapon and explosion sounds, but it actually is in a first-person shooter. That's one of the biggest things you need to worry about in the sound design, because you really need to make sure that those guns and explosions sound really satisfying, and that's just not the case here. I mean, hell, when the gun and explosion sounds in the original Doom from 1993 sound better than the gun and explosion sounds from the one in 2016, you know you have a serious problem. But then there's the final element of the sound design to talk about, and arguably the most interesting part of it, which is the soundtrack composed by Mick Gordon. He actually did a GDC talk about composing the soundtrack for this game, which was actually a pretty interesting watch. It also explains why the soundtrack is primarily composed of nothing but obnoxious, migraine-inducing electric noise. You see, when id Software approached Mick to do the soundtrack for the new Doom, he was explicitly told not to put guitars in it. Now, for those of you who may not understand how much of a mortal sin that is for a Doom game, understand that the original Doom, from the imagery to the actual soundtrack itself, is very heavily inspired by heavy metal, particularly speed and thrash metal, but also some degree of death and black metal. And despite the original game's soundtrack being a bunch of MIDI tracks, it definitely wore its influences on its sleeve. So to say no guitars in a Doom game is absolute heresy. Thing is, Mick tried to find a way to basically sneak the guitars in there, and he found a way of doing this by making the guitar extremely low-pitched and repetitive to the point where it just blends in with all the other electronic noise. And as he continued to push a bit more slightly up-tuned guitar in there over a period of time, and it kept okaying it, eventually he was able to get guitar in there in a more recognizable form, but it's still incredibly low-pitched and repetitive, which lumps it into the same category as djent, which I would describe as the guitar equivalent of dubstep. It's mindless, repetitive, obnoxious noise. There are very few tracks in the entire game that I could reliably describe as music, and most of those fall more into the industrial side of things than anything else, and are not even present when all the action's kicking off. Hell, basically the best track in the entire game is the very short rendition of E1M1, and that's only because it's recognizable as E1M1. And the worst part about all of this is I know for a fact Mick Gordon can do a hell of a lot better than this. Look at the soundtrack for Killer Instinct, or hell, even the work he did on Lawbreakers, as much of a failure as that game was. When he's not doing this djenty crap and is dipping more into the industrial and proper hard rock and metal side of things, he can pull off some fantastic work. And what he ended up producing for this particular game is frankly just a waste of his talent. And the damage that this soundtrack does to the game is frankly irreparable, because now you have a game that looks the part, it looks exactly like you would expect a modernized Doom to look, but it doesn't sound like Doom. Not even close. From the sound effects themselves to the absolute mess of a soundtrack. And all of that brought together makes the presentation one hell of a mixed bag. But it's not all about the presentation. What really matter are story and gameplay, except in the case of Doom, story doesn't really matter all that much, which is why it's pretty baffling that they put a pretty huge emphasis on story and especially lore in this. You see, the original Doom and Doom 2 didn't really have much going on in terms of storyline. You were just some unnamed marine who had to fight his way through the demonic hordes in order to stop them from invading Earth, and after failing that, fighting to kick them off of Earth. And it's never really been a problem that the storylines in the original Doom and Doom 2 were not much more than basic setup for why you're doing what you're doing, and it was all about the gameplay in those games. Even by the time you got to Doom 3, there still wasn't really much of a storyline in that game, and it didn't really serve to do much more than give you some basic context for why you're doing what you're doing either, although it still had cutscenes and it had some vague degree of storyline. Then you get to the rebooted Doom, and all of a sudden they actually care about the storyline, so much so in fact that they throw in quite a few unskippable cutscenes that require you to either just sit around and wait for people to finish talking while you just bounce around impatiently because they for some reason let you continue to have control in those instances, or in the case of the cutscenes where it takes control away from you, you just have to wait until it plays out. And what is this storyline they were so insistent that you experience in its entirety? Well, you play as a warrior who is referred to as the Doomslayer, who has been fighting the hordes of hell for an eternity, and who was only stopped by being lured into a trap where he was imprisoned in a tomb and just left there for who knows how long, until the UAC, the Union Aerospace Corporation, the, of course, big evil corporation that is present in all of the Doom games, managed to excavate the sarcophagus containing the Doomslayer and took it back to their Mars facility for study along with a bunch of other artifacts including his armor, and they've been doing all kinds of incredibly dangerous research involving both hell and the Argent energy that they've been siphoning from it to solve the energy crisis on Earth. Eventually, the UAC scientist Olivia Pierce makes a pact with Hell and goes to try to open the portal between realms in order to allow the forces of Hell to spill into this dimension, and the Mars facility subsequently gets completely overrun by demons. It's at this point that the sarcophagus is opened and the Doomslayer is let loose, or I should say that he breaks free from the restraints holding him in the sarcophagus and proceeds to carve a bloody swath through the forces of Hell in an attempt to close the portal. Along the way, he is assisted by the facility's AI, Vega, as well as the leader of the facility, Dr. Samuel Hayden, who initially provide instructions for shutting down the facility rather than completely destroying it, but after the Doomslayer makes it clear that he has no intention of doing anything but destroying the facility, just kind of go along for the ride. And that's pretty much it, actually. You'll just be playing as the Doomslayer as he fights his way through the hordes of Hell on the Mars facility and eventually fighting his way into and out of Hell itself to find a way to close the portal and stop the invasion of Hell's forces. Now at this point you may be wondering, but DW, if there's not much of a story in this, then why would they focus on the story quite a bit and throw in a bunch of unskippable cutscenes that you had to put up with? Your guess is as good as mine, actually. I really don't know. In the case of the really short unskippable cutscenes, it's not that big of a problem, because it's usually used to introduce new monster types, or it's used as a brief moment where you're interacting with a panel or something, and the Doomslayer either shoves the panel away forcefully, or he kicks something to pieces in order to stop it from working, or something along those lines, where you're getting that sort of attitude that the Doomslayer has towards this whole thing of, I'm just so done with this UAC crap, and I'm just gonna fight demons in the way I know how. Now the problem isn't with those cutscenes as much as it is with the ones that are unskippable but have you sitting there listening to a monologue for a fairly long period of time where the person's just telling you all this stuff about things that you don't really give much of a crap about because it doesn't have any bearing on what you're actually doing. And frankly, why they were even concerned with the story in a Doom game to begin with is beyond me. It's Doom after all. Nobody plays Doom for the storyline. And that makes the plethora of lore entries in the game that much more confusing, because again, nobody really cares about the story of Doom, so why did they expect anybody would really care about the lore either? I mean, do we really need to know why the heavy assault rifle is the way it is, or what the BFG 9000 is other than a big fucking gun? Obviously not, but they decided to put lore entries in the game anyway, and the amount that you will find throughout the course of the game is pretty ludicrous, actually. And the only ones you might actually find interesting are the so-called Slayer's Testaments, which are these various stones that you'll find throughout Hell, where you can go up and activate them, and then a demonic voice will tell you the legend of the Doomslayer, and all that basically tells you is that you are basically an unstoppable juggernaut of death that the denizens of Hell are completely terrified of. And even that only gives you a few snippets, like the fact that you've apparently been fighting your way through Hell for an eternity, effectively, and you have a suit of armor that was crafted for you by a traitor demon referred to as the Wretch. Apparently you also previously took down a demon referred to as the Titan, which apparently came at you with the fury of everything that you had slain up to that point, but that wasn't enough. Because as we all know, the Doomslayer is just too angry to die. In fact, that is basically how I would sum up the entirety of the story and lore in this. The only thing you really need to know is as follows.
They are rage, brutal, without mercy. But you will be worse. Rip and tear until it is done.
That's right, the rip and tear your guts line from the meme-tastic Doom comic, which featured a berserked out Doom guy constantly shrieking that kind of thing while he tears demons apart with his bare hands, is finally getting its prime time in a mainstream Doom game as an actual gameplay mechanic, as opposed to only being in the series as part of mods like Brutal Doom. And this does lead me into what really matters here, which is the gameplay, because story in Doom, who really gives a crap? Gameplay, that's what matters. So what exactly does this play like? Is it a faithful recreation of the gameplay style of classic Doom but with modern ideas and modern mechanics, or does it do something else entirely? Well, it has some of the hallmarks like you would expect, like being able to carry a ton of weapons at once instead of the 2-weapon limit you see on the vast majority of console-oriented shooters, as well as being able to find secret areas in the levels that allow you to get extra stocks of ammo or health, or maybe even get access to certain weapons earlier than you ordinarily would. And there is the return of key hunting, where you'll need to track down blue and yellow key cards as well as blue and yellow skull keys in order to progress further on in the levels. The original weapon lineup from both Doom 1 and 2 does make a return, with the pistol, shotgun, super shotgun, chain gun, rocket launcher, plasma gun, and BFG 9000, all available for you to pulverize your foes with, and they brought back the invulnerability and berserk power-ups from the original Doom games, as well as brought in the quad damage power-up from the Quake series. They even brought back the feature where you have to find an auto-map terminal somewhere in the level to be able to fill out the entirety of the map. Only this time around, it's not just an item that you pick up by walking over it. It's an actual terminal you have to go up and interact with in order to download the map. Same functionality though. All the enemy types from the original game also make a return, from the early game threats like imps and possessed soldiers, on up through the more powerful stuff like Hell Knights, Barons of Hell, Mancubus, Cacodemon, whatever the case may be. If it appeared in the original Doom games, chances are you're going to be fighting it here. The only noticeable exceptions to that rule are the Arachnotrons, Pain Elementals, and the Archviles, none of which you will see in this particular game, but it has been confirmed they are in the upcoming Doom Eternal. And they even implemented certain secret areas where you can access them and find that they've put out an area that is a small section from one of the levels of the original Doom games, and it even has all of the original Doom's textures and everything. Obviously those are just there for a bit of nostalgia, but it is still interesting to see them in the game. But here's the thing. That's where all of the stuff from the original Doom games ends, and all of the new or heavily modified stuff begins. There are two new weapons, the Gauss Cannon, which is more or less the game's equivalent of a railgun, and the Heavy Assault Rifle, which is more or less the game's equivalent of a machine gun. And one of the first things you'll notice about all of these weapons is that they all have secondary fire functions, although the only weapon that starts with one is the pistol, where it starts with a charge-up shot that does quite a bit more damage and is very accurate. To get the secondary fire functions on all of the other weapons, first you actually have to have that weapon in your inventory, and then you have to go up to a field drone, which are various pickup items scattered around the levels and require a bit of traversing to find a lot of the time, and you can activate it in order to get one of two modifications that will give that weapon a secondary fire function. For example, the basic combat shotgun has either an attachment that gives it a 3-round burst capability or an attachment that gives it a grenade launcher capability. And while a field drone only contains one attachment, you can still get the other attachment later on if you find another field drone, and you can swap between them using the appropriate button. Some of these attachments are definitely more useful than others, however. For example, the only one I used on the combat shotgun was the grenade launcher attachment, even though I did pick up the 3-round burst one, because the grenade launcher is simply a lot more effective than the 3-round burst is. The idea is to give all of your weapons a bit of utility that you wouldn't ordinarily see in a first-person shooter. So, for example, with the combat shotgun, ordinarily you'd think about replacing it once you get the super shotgun, but because it has the grenade launcher capability or the 3-round burst capability, you might consider using it in certain situations or against certain enemy types instead of just switching over to the super shotgun for the entirety of the run. Similarly, you might think that once you get the chain gun, there wouldn't be much reason to use the heavy assault rifle anymore, but the heavy assault rifle comes with an attachment that gives it a micro missile launcher, which admittedly is basically useless once you get the actual rocket launcher, or it gives you a scope that you can get extra headshot damage with. And this system generally works well in theory, where the idea is to give you a bunch of different capabilities so you're constantly swapping between weapons as you're going through the course of the game in order to meet the situation at hand. In practice, however, they leaned way too heavily on the phrase rip and tear. This is where the new glory kill system comes into play and where the game almost turns into more of a brawler than a first-person shooter. You see, when you do enough damage to the enemies, they get put into a stun state, and if you have the UI feature enabled, then they're highlighted blue at first, then it turns orange, then they lose the stun state. But while they're in this state, you can run up to them and press the melee key, and the Doomslayer proceeds to finish the enemy off with his bare hands in a gruesome fashion. In so doing, so long as you've taken damage along the way, you'll also gain a small amount of health back. This is basically their idea of a push-forward combat system, where you are meant to constantly be going forward, as opposed to the typical modern shooter trend of taking cover behind objects and just peeking out to shoot at enemies, then going back into cover and hiding there when you've taken damage, and that sort of thing. It's a very similar idea to the health regen system in Warhammer 40,000 Space Marine, where you could get a bunch of health back by doing a melee finisher on an enemy. Now, of course, you might be thinking, well, if it worked for the testosterone factory known as Warhammer 40,000, obviously it can work in Doom, and you would be right to some degree. It does work, but it comes at a pretty hefty cost. And regardless of whether they simply made the enemies complete bullet sponges, or they actually deliberately weakened all of the weapons to make sure that you would be putting enemies in pain states a lot more than you'd be putting them in the ground, the end result is the same. Unless you're fighting the most ridiculously wimpy enemies in the game, which in this case are the possessed scientists who just wander around and try to smack you with their bare hands, you're going to be spending an awful lot of ammunition, even from the most powerful weapons in your arsenal, to drop most of the enemies in the game. Even the weaker enemies in the game, like the possessed soldiers and the imps, take a rather large amount of damage before they're even put in a stun state, let alone taken down entirely. And even as you continue through the game and get access to new weapons, as well as the attachments that give you all sorts of different secondary fires for those weapons, and even as you're continuing to upgrade those using the weapon upgrade points that you simply earn by playing, the enemies never stop being bullet sponges. If anything, it only gets worse the further you get in, because they keep introducing even more bullet spongy enemies for you to fight. And it's like they knew this was a problem, because they completely overhauled the way the chainsaw works in this, to where you now have an ammunition counter for it that is represented by fuel, and when you go up to an enemy and use the chainsaw on them, it instantly kills them and gives you a massive amount of ammunition back for all of your other weapons. And the funny thing about that is that the enemies are so spongy on the damage they can take that even with the chainsaw's ammunition replenishing capabilities, I still almost ran out of ammunition entirely on a couple of the fights. This ultimately means that all of the weapons feel woefully underpowered, with the exception of the BFG 9000, which at least does pretty much what you would expect it to do, unless you're fighting a boss, of course, in which case things are a bit different, but I'll at least cut that some slack because it's boss fights. In the case of all of the other weapons, well, let's just face it, it's hard to get excited for the super shotgun in this when you know it was absolutely devastating even against massive groups in the original implementation in Doom 2, and then you get to this game and you find that you can barely take out a single enemy with it, and even then, unless it's an imp, it's probably still going to take a couple of shots to bring them down. And the story is much the same with all the other weapons. The rocket launcher in the original Doom games was absolutely devastating on target most of the time. In this one, it's basically a passing wind to most of the enemies. Plasma gun, absolutely devastating in the original games, and this one generally quite weak unless you're just trying to focus fire on a single large enemy. And even then, you're going to be firing at that enemy for quite a long time. And even the two new weapons, the heavy assault rifle and the Gauss cannon, don't feel like they have that much effect on target unless you're just attacking the weakest enemies in the game. Now don't get me wrong, there were quite a few enemies in the original games that could take a fair bit of punishment before going down, but it didn't feel like your weapons were woefully underpowered for the task. I mean, think about it this way. In Doom 2, the super shotgun would drop a pinky demon in one shot, whereas in this one, well, good luck with that. And again, this choice of weakening the weapons or making the enemies a lot more damage resistant, whichever the case they actually did in the actual game files, ends up with the same result. They deliberately weakened your effect on target in order to make the glory kills much more prominent. And because you're going through the same canned animations over and over and over again with these glory kills, it very quickly becomes tiresome. And by quickly, I mean you'll be tired of them by the end of the first level, and you're having to do it constantly throughout the rest of the roughly 12-hour campaign. I mean, sure, you can just keep shooting the demons, and occasionally they'll drop a bit of health for you to pick up if you continue doing that, but it does that less often than the glory kills do, and more importantly, it uses more of your precious ammo. To make matters worse, they implemented a very extensive upgrade system where you have the Praetor suit upgrades as well as the weapon upgrades, as well as Argent Energy that will allow you to increase the amount of health, armor, and energy that you have at maximum. And I guarantee you that the very first thing you're going to max out with your Argent Energy is the ammo, because you start with barely any ammo reserves, and so you'll very quickly be running out of ammo right from the start. And once again, I have to do a direct comparison between the original Doom games and Doom 2016. In the original games, you started with a max ammo reserve of 50 shells for the shotguns, which could be bumped up to 100 once you've found a backpack somewhere in the levels. In Doom 2016, you start with a maximum of 20 shells and can bump that up to an absolute maximum with the full track maxed out from all the Argent Energy of 60 shells. I could go on. Energy cell maximum in Doom 2016 for your plasma rifle and your Gauss cannon starts at 150, and then you can get it up to an absolute max of 350. In the original Doom and Doom 2, it started at 400, and with a backpack it could go up to 600. Now admittedly, back in those games, the BFG 9000 also used the same ammunition, and in this particular game it has its own ammunition, which in this game maxes out at 3 shots in total, and that's regardless of what your Argent Energy is. But the point still remains. Chain gun and heavy assault rifle both use the same ammunition, which is bullets, and in this game it starts out at a maximum of 90 with an absolute maximum with your maxed out Argent Energy of 210. When you look at the original Doom, started at 200 and went up to 400 with a backpack. And then of course there's rockets, starts at a maximum of 15 in this game and maxes out in total of 35, whereas in the original game it started at 50 and maxed out at 100 with a backpack. Now admittedly in the original Doom and Doom 2 that could be a bit overkill and you would end up having way more ammo than you really needed in a lot of instances, but there were still situations where you needed to be conservative with what ammo you had. In Doom 2016, you are constantly having to be conservative with what ammo you have because the enemies are just such bullet sponges that you actually do run the risk of running out of it. I'm sure this is where the Doom 2016 fanboys are already taking to the comments saying all sorts of things about how I suck at the game and I need to get good and all that kind of crap. Well, to be perfectly frank here, apart from just aiming at things, there's not really much to get good about. And really the only difficulty you're going to have with the aiming is the fact that the crosshair on the heavy assault rifle is so faint you can barely even see it. You'll see people saying you need to dodge enemy attacks, that you need to do bunny hopping, you need to do this and that and the other thing. Well, here's the thing, you can't do bunny hopping because you get a double jump fairly close to the beginning of the game, and that constantly interferes with your bunny hopping, and even then, you don't gain any speed from bunny hopping, and the enemies can just easily predict where you're going to be bunny hopping to, so it never ends up being that effective. And more importantly, even though the enemies do throw actual projectiles at you as opposed to just hit scan, unfortunately the movement speed isn't quite fast enough to where you can actually dodge those projectiles unless you're at a pretty far distance away from them. I mean, sure, it's faster than your average console shooter, but that's not saying much when the average console shooter is so slow it feels like you're wading through a tar pit half the time. This means that in a lot of fights it's going to be effectively impossible to actually avoid taking damage, and you just have to hope you're able to tank what damage you actually do end up taking. Sure, the original Doom games had hit scanners, but you would prioritize those targets and they would cease to be that big of a problem. In this one, it's more of a matter of just keep moving, hope the enemy doesn't hit you in the process, and keep an eye out for all of the health and armor pickups because you're gonna need them. And even with all of the issues of almost running out of ammo a lot of times, and the fact that it's pretty much impossible to avoid taking damage in certain instances, I still had very few instances where I actually died due to enemy action. I actually ended up dying more to environmental hazards and glitches than anything else, which was extremely strange. And the environmental hazards basically ceased being a problem once I unlocked the Praetor suit upgrade that prevents damage from explosive barrels. This does bring me to something that is actually very important to bring up. There are a ton of upgrades you can get for both the Praetor suit and your weapons themselves that will increase your capabilities. For the Praetor suit, there's things like being able to no longer take damage from explosive barrels, or be able to hot swap the weapon parts faster, or to climb ledges faster, or get better auto map capabilities, or whatever the case may be. And then for the weapon upgrades, there's things that will reduce the cooldown times on the secondary fires, or make them have a wider area effect, or do more damage, or something along those lines that makes those attachments quite a bit more effective. And then once you've gotten all of the upgrades for any given attachment, you unlock the ability to complete a challenge to get the final mastery unlock, which increases its capabilities even further. You may be thinking to yourself that this would fix the problem with the bullet sponge enemies, but it really does not. It makes the weapons slightly more effective, which is nowhere near sufficient to make them actually feel like powerful weapons. In fact, barely any of the upgrades you can get in general have much effect on the way the game actually plays out. Obviously, more health, ammo, and armor are always going to be a positive, but things like climbing ledges faster, could take it or leave it. The speed at which you can climb ledges was never really a problem in the first place. The movement speed itself is the problem, and they don't have anything that actually fixes that except for the haste power-up. And obviously the haste power-up has a limited time effect, so that's only a temporary solution. Not even the runes you can unlock by completing the various rune trials scattered around the maps really help all that much. There are a few that are certainly nice to have, like the Rich Get Richer one, which means you don't actually expend any ammo as long as your armor stays above 100, but a fair few of them only provide bonuses to glory kills, so unless you're performing those constantly, they're not really that useful. Some of them are really not useful at all, like the one that gives you better air control on double jumps, which frankly is completely unnecessary. So only a few of the runes are worth completing the rune trials for to begin with, and even then you actually have to find those rune trials, and then on top of that, to be able to get the second level of that particular rune, you had to complete the mastery task, which is obviously different for each rune, and for the most part they're just not all that interesting. They're things like use equipment 30 times, or perform 75 glory kills, or kill 50 enemies while you're speed boosted, or something along those lines. They're not exactly things that test your skills, certainly not like the actual rune trials are, some of which can be downright infuriating with how specific you have to be able to complete them. On top of that, you start out being able to only equip one rune at a time, and eventually you unlock the ability to equip a second and eventually a third one, but that really requires you to deliberately seek out those rune trials and complete them in order to continue getting those additional slots to equip more runes. And with them being completely optional, you can go through the entire game completely ignoring the rune trial system entirely, and it really won't affect your game all that much. In fact, that's exactly what I did for the playthrough I completed for this review. I completely ignored the rune trials, having actually messed around with them in past attempts at playthroughs, and just found them to be either annoying or not all that useful, so I decided to ignore them for this one, and I didn't really feel like I missed out on much. Sure, having a few of the runes might have made the run a bit easier or very slightly less tedious, but it would have still ultimately been tedious because no matter what you're doing, you're still going up against a ton of bullet sponges, and every single level is designed in pretty much exactly the same way, where instead of the more intricate level designs that were clearly designed with a level flow in mind like you would have in the original Doom games, this is designed more like Serious Sam, where you go into an area, it's an obvious combat arena, it locks everything around you, and then the game proceeds to spawn monsters in an incredibly obvious manner, and does so in waves until eventually you've satisfied whatever wave requirement that particular arena had, and then whatever was boxing you into that particular area will open up and allow you to continue wherever you were going or go explore somewhere else. And here's the thing, while that works in Serious Sam, it only works in those games because the levels are absolutely gigantic, and the amount of enemies you're fighting in those instances is similarly enormous, precisely because the levels are so big that they can accommodate that. That's not the case in Doom 2016. Most of the combat arenas in this are really not very big at all, and even if they are larger, they still don't throw in enough enemies to where it would really justify using the space, and the wave-based format just quickly becomes tedious. It's one of the many smaller touches that the game really lacks. Sure, it does have more open levels than you're used to in the vast majority of first-person shooters these days, but the only thing you're really getting out of the vast majority of that is just some extra collectibles to find and maybe an early weapon or two. You look at the way the levels were designed, and you can't really say there was a whole lot of artistry that went into actually designing the levels themselves. The art assets that make them up? Sure, definitely a lot of artistry went into that, but the actual level designs themselves remind me a lot of the likes of, say, Treyarch's level designs, where they're just connecting a bunch of combat arenas together in a rather utilitarian way. It's designed to work, but not really be all that interesting. I mean, think about it this way. If you play through the entirety of Doom 2016, you will struggle to remember how any of the individual levels in it actually work. You might be able to remember a few set pieces here and there, but the rest of it is just going to be a blur of generic-looking corridors and generic-looking arenas that you fought in that you can't really tell apart from one another. Even the boss fights aren't especially memorable. I mean, sure, there are certainly more complex boss fights than the likes of the original Doom games, but they don't really do anything all that special, and frankly, the boss fights themselves are actually incredibly easy. The only one I had even the slightest trouble with was the Spider Mastermind fight at the very end of the game, and that's only because a lot of its moves are pretty cheap. But regardless of which boss you're fighting, they're basically just a gigantic bullet sponge that takes an absolutely ludicrous amount of damage to bring down, and you have to finish them off with a glory kill. Because when you get down to it, everything in this game goes right back to that phrase, rip and tear until it is done. It's a fundamental misunderstanding of what made Doom great in the first place. Sure, the original Doom had the Berserk power-up, and that was incredibly fun to use when you had it. And sure, the Doom comic has that phrase, rip and tear your guts, and that is incredibly amusing precisely because the Doom comic is so bad it's good. But that's not what Doom was about. Doom was about being a very tightly constructed, fast-paced first-person shooter with weapons that feel fantastic, and that is just not what you get here. Sure, it's faster and more arcadey than most console shooters. Sure, the Doomslayer has that sort of irreverent attitude you'd really hope that a classic first-person shooter protagonist would have. Sure, they seem to have their hearts in the right place. The problem is that the execution was severely lacking in a lot of ways. The level design simply wasn't Doom. It's more Serious Sam than anything else, and while that works fine in Serious Sam, with Doom, we expect more tightly crafted level design than this, and we certainly expect more than just constant wave-based combat. The amount of damage your weapons do to the enemies is simply not enough, whether they just have too much health or whether the weapons themselves were deliberately weakened in order to get the glory kills to be viable. The glory kills themselves very quickly become boring precisely because there is way too much emphasis placed on them. Had they made them more rare or made them something you only get with the Berserk power-up, they'd do a lot better job of rewarding those very animalistic instincts you get from playing a first-person shooter where you just really want to pulverize things, and that would just go a long way to making the game feel more like a proper Doom game. The vast majority of the upgrades you get throughout the course of the game either don't really affect the gameplay all that much or are simply not interesting. And in a game where you have to go out of your way to find all of the Praetor suit tokens to be able to upgrade your suit, as well as go out of your way to complete all the rune trials to get the various runes, and then go out of your way to complete various mastery tasks in order to be able to fully upgrade all of your weapons as well as your runes, that ultimately just makes the upgrade system a chore more than anything else. Had they given you some more upgrades that actually increase your capabilities beyond simply improving cooldown timers or maybe improving blast radius on a particular weapon or something like that, there would actually be a proper incentive for going out of your way to get those upgrades, and as it stands, there's just not all that much reason to really worry about it. And then on top of all of that, the movement system is simply not fast enough to be able to dodge most of the projectiles that the enemies are throwing at you unless you're just really far away from those enemies to begin with, and that's not the way the game is designed to be played. And when you do decide to get closer to the enemy and start actually taking damage, the game doesn't really give you enough feedback to make it clear that you are taking damage, and more importantly that you're taking a lot of damage, until it's basically too late and you get that final notification of low health where the suit actually pipes in for a change. And while any one of these issues alone isn't enough to completely destroy the game, when you combine them all, it all ends up making the single player campaign a very disappointing mess, where you can very easily see what could have been had they put that extra bit of effort in, had they made it just that bit faster, given the weapons that much more punch, and so on. And that's ultimately what makes the single player so frustrating. It's not that it's an outright bad game, because it's not an outright bad game. It's a disappointingly mediocre game whose problems all could have been fixed, and hopefully will be fixed with the upcoming sequel, but that remains to be seen. But here's the thing, the Doom reboot is more than just its single-player campaign. Sure, the vast majority of people will only care about the single-player campaign, but the game does have a multiplayer mode, and it does have some degree of co-op via the Snapmap system. So how do these modes fare? Well, I'll go ahead and talk about the multiplayer first, because I actually have the least to say about it. The idea behind the Versus multiplayer mode is that it's supposed to be that return to classic arena shooter gameplay, but with a slightly modern twist on things. The problem with their interpretation of this is that they clearly do not understand how arena shooters are meant to be played. You see, a proper arena shooter is an even playing field, where everybody starts with the same exact health and armor levels as well as the same exact weapons, and it's all about map control. You gotta know where all of the weapon pickups are, you need to know where all of the power-ups are gonna spawn, and you need to know the best flow for getting where you need to go in any given map. This means that any proper arena shooter is going to be entirely about the individual player's skills. How does Doom 2016 decide to implement this? By making it so you have a 2-weapon limit, which is dictated entirely by a loadout you select before you spawn, which is composed of weapons that you have to unlock using the game's progression system, where simply playing the game longer gets you access to better equipment, including not only weapons that are simply not available in the single-player campaign, but also additional demon types beyond simply the Revenant. Because apparently it wasn't enough for them to destroy the entire concept of an arena shooter by putting in loadouts and relegating the only weapon pickup to be the Gauss cannon, which will spawn occasionally whenever the demon rune or the quad damage is not spawning, resulting in some players being at a distinct advantage to others simply by nature of whatever they have in their loadout compared to all of the other players, especially if those other players haven't unlocked the ability to make custom loadouts, and more importantly, unlocked the additional weapons. Now, in addition to all of that, they threw in a new power-up called the Demon Rune, which when you pick it up, turns you into a demon, which you start out as being able to turn into a Revenant, but you can also unlock the ability to turn into other types of demons, for example a Mancubus. And as a demon, you are extremely resilient to damage, and you can dish out an absolute metric ton of damage yourself, meaning that it's basically a bunch of free kills. And not only that, but it lasts for quite a long time, way longer than the quad damage does, which means that it's just blatantly overpowered. Now you may think to yourself, because it's a pickup that spawns in at a particular interval and you have to go to that particular spot on the map to find it, that makes it a matter of map control, but once somebody has the Demon Rune, they're probably not going to be kicked out of it until just the timer expires, and throughout that entire period, they're basically unstoppable. And that combined with the fact that the additional demon types you can unlock are usually more resilient than the one that you start with, the Revenant, means that it's yet another element of the game that completely ruins the concept of an even playing field like an arena shooter should have. And between the loadouts and the unlockables and the demon rune completely breaking what semblance of balance the game could have had for its multiplayer, and the peer-to-peer with matchmaking system, or listen server system if you prefer to be technical, where one of the players in a lobby is designated as the host of the match, and as such the match is subject to whatever their connection speed is, and they're just going to have a blatant advantage over all the other players because they're not going to have the same latency problems that everybody else is having. You end up with a multiplayer system that's just an absolute disaster, and on top of all of that, there's barely any degree of anti-cheat in here, so cheating online is absolutely rampant. And the final few nails in the multiplayer's coffin are the fact that the offline practice mode does not actually count towards any of your progression at all, which wasn't really expected, but still is definitely a downside. And the bots are just utterly baffling, because on the normal difficulty and lower, they are so laughably easy that they put up basically no fight at all, and on any difficulty setting higher than normal, they basically act like they're cheaters themselves, with the equivalent of wall hacks and aimbots, where they basically never miss a single shot, and they just take you down before you even really have a chance to react. So you can't even just go into a bot match without it being completely foobar. So while the single player portion of the game could certainly be fixed, the multiplayer basically requires a ground up redesign to be even slightly acceptable, let alone actually even approaching decent. But what about the Snapmap feature, where you can get additional single player, co-op, and multiplayer content? Well, that's where things get a bit interesting, because the entire point of Snapmap is to basically be this game's equivalent of the modding scene. You see, in case you aren't aware, the Doom series has a very long history of modding, whether that be simply additional maps for the multiplayer, or additional single-player maps, or full-on single-player campaigns, which is basically what you ended up with stuff like the Plutonia Experiment or TNT Evolution being basically mod packs that were turned into full standalone products, or even extensive rewrites of the game code to where it almost plays like something completely different, or outright plays like something completely different in the case of things like the Head-On mod, which eventually became a full standalone game, or mods like Brutal Doom, which completely overhaul the gameplay mechanics and basically become something else entirely. So how does Snapmap fit in with that venerable tradition? Well, it basically allows pretty much anybody to join the modding scene in some capacity, and you just go into that, and you can start making whatever levels you want, whether that be single player, co-op, or multiplayer, and you can put in enemy spawns, you can pick what weapons you want available in the map, you can set up all sorts of event triggers as well as teleporters or locked doors that you'll need to find key cards open, all sorts of things like that, pretty much what you would expect after having played through the single player. And of course, setting up a map as a multiplayer map is pretty much what you would expect if you're familiar with how the multiplayer works. And while it is a fairly easy system to use, you are rather limited in what you can actually do with it. You've got very few parameters you can actually mess around with, and there's no way to extensively overhaul the way the gameplay actually works. On top of that, you are limited to a set of prefab rooms that you can fit together at certain points, hence the idea of Snapmap. You just snap the things together and you're good to go. But that also means that you really don't have any way of truly customizing things the way you want them to be customized. Now don't get me wrong, the Doom modding scene being what it is, people have still managed to come up with some pretty interesting ways of messing around with it and making sure that it does offer a noticeably different gameplay experience than what you see in the single player campaign and the multiplayer. But the fact that Snapmap does still heavily limit what you're actually capable of doing means that you're never going to end up with the same kind of modding scene in this that you would see in classic Doom games, or even to a lesser degree Doom 3. And that just screams of missed opportunity. They really could have embraced the modding community and offered a proper set of true mod tools, as opposed to offering what is more or less the same kind of thing you would see in the likes of Time Splitters. Where sure, you can create maps using a bunch of prefab assets and it's very easy to use, but there's not a whole lot of substance to it. And when you bring all of the elements of the game together, what you ultimately end up with is just a disappointingly mediocre game. Sure, the multiplayer is downright terrible, but the rest of the game is not bad by any stretch of the imagination. It's just not particularly great either. It's certainly a better Doom game than Doom 3 was, although admittedly that's really not saying much, but it's severely held back by the fact that the developers clearly did not truly understand what made Doom great in the first place. They came pretty close in in some areas, but they leaned way too heavily on the meme of rip and tear until it is done, and the actual shooting element of this first-person shooter suffered very heavily as a result. And that fundamental misunderstanding is present in really all aspects of the game, from the absolutely terrible multiplayer, to the rather mediocre single-player campaign, to even the certain set-piece moments where it should be something awesome, but it ends up not being. For example, with the BFG, when you first get that, you're thinking, oh, this should be awesome, it's the BFG 9000. But then it opens the door in front of you, and it's just a room full of the absolute weakest enemies in the game that you can just demolish in a single pistol shot anyway, so why would you be impressed by that? Aside from fundamental misunderstandings of level design and gameplay mechanics, you have a fundamental misunderstanding of what the soundtrack should be, which is incredibly annoying. You have the fundamental misunderstanding of what the modding community really wants from the game, and thus you end up with the rather mediocre Snapmap. And they didn't seem to understand that nobody really cares about the story of the Doom series. It's all been about gameplay from the very beginning, and the story is not much more than some basic context of what you're doing and why you're doing it. Thus, you end up with a game that is filled to the brim with all sorts of collectibles that flesh out the lore of the series for some utterly baffling reason, as if that's something that people actually care about. I mean, sure, there's a minority of players that do care about it, but they're just that, a minority. Nobody really cares about how the BFG 9000 came into existence or what makes it work. They care about what it actually does. But as far as the lore goes, it seems like the developers adopted the stance of caring far more about whether they could put a bunch of lore in there, and didn't stop to think about whether they actually should. And the end result is a fairly confused mess of a game that doesn't really understand what a proper Doom game is like, and doesn't understand how to bring classic gameplay principles to the modern era. It's not an outright bad game, but it plays more like a weird mix of Halo and Serious Sam, with a really bizarre emphasis on melee finishers more than anything else. They absolutely nailed the look of Doom, and they certainly nailed the attitude in a lot of ways, but they just didn't nail enough of the particulars for it to actually pull through, and as a result, I really can't give this game any more than a 2 out of 5. Again, I wouldn't say it's an outright bad game overall, but it's certainly mediocre at best, and generally is very disappointing. Thankfully, nearly all of the issues the game has could be fixed with just a bit of tweaking. It wouldn't even require extensive overhauls for the most part to make what doesn't work in this game actually work. They just didn't accomplish that with this first game in the new rebooted Doom series. I certainly hoped that they had improved things with the upcoming Doom Eternal, but everything I've seen in the pre-release information that's been leading up to that has not exactly been encouraging. But thankfully, if you're looking for a proper classic first-person shooter experience, there are plenty of other games out there right now that actually fit that bill. Stuff like Dusk, or Medieval, or the semi-upcoming Wrath Aeon of Ruin, which all do have that very classic first-person shooter feel and really nail a lot of the particulars that Doom 2016 frankly didn't. But as for whether or not they actually improved things for Doom Eternal, well, we'll just have to wait and see on that. I'll certainly reserve full judgment until I can actually get my hands on the full game and play it. But I can't help but be concerned that the hype train for Doom Eternal is setting a lot of people up for disappointment. But we'll just have to wait and see on that. Thank you all very much for watching. I'll see you all in later videos.